What happens when the company that fires you forgets who really holds the power? I was labeled too expensive and let go without a second thought. But they overlooked one critical detail. I was the one who negotiated every contract that kept their business running. And I wasn't about to go quietly. The day they let me go started like any other. Coffee in one hand, tablet in the other, running through contract adjustments before our weekly vendor sync. I wasn't just part of Aldridge and Keene, I was embedded in its foundation. I'd been with them since the company was barely staying afloat, and in those early years, I negotiated vendor terms so favorable that they were still riding on my deals 10 years later. I didn't expect applause or parades. That wasn't my style. But I did expect respect. So when I got a calendar invite labeled Personnel Discussion, HR and Finance, I had a feeling something was off. And when I walked into the boardroom, the tight smiles and lack of eye contact told me everything I needed to know. They didn't even try to make it sound personal. Miles, we've reviewed the budget and you're simply too expensive to retain. That was it. 10 years boiled down to a spreadsheet. My value, my strategy, my deep-rooted connections, was reduced to a number that no longer fit their model. I didn't protest. I didn't beg. I watched them like I'd watched many others before, people who thought they understood leverage. But as I left with my box of belongings and that neatly printed severance letter, I smiled. Because I knew something they didn't. While they'd fired a name on paper, they had just amputated their strongest artery. And soon, they'd feel the bleed. Even before that final meeting, I'd started noticing the change in tone. Conversations I was normally part of began happening without me. Meetings were rescheduled last minute, or worse, held without notice. I caught glimpses of faces ducking into offices, whispers trailing off when I walked by. At first, I chalked it up to end-of-quarter pressure. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. People I mentored suddenly looked through me. I wasn't paranoid, I was being phased out, piece by piece, quietly. One day, I passed the executive lounge and caught my name. He's good, but too entrenched. We need fresh blood, cheaper blood. They didn't realize I was there until I cleared my throat. The look on their faces confirmed everything. My fate had already been sealed long before that official HR meeting. They thought they were being subtle. They thought I was blind to the political undertones. But I heard it all, and I stored every word. Not out of spite, out of strategy. They framed it as a cost-saving initiative. That was the official language. I'd heard it used on vendors, on department heads, even on entire regional offices, always with the same detached corporate script. But hearing it aimed at me, after everything I'd done, was surreal. I wasn't a liability. I was an asset they had undervalued because they didn't understand the invisible work I did. The kind of work that doesn't show up in flashy reports but keeps the business from collapsing under its own weight. They didn't cut my role to save money. They cut it because they didn't realize how much I was worth. They assumed my job was just negotiation and paperwork. They had no idea the years I spent nurturing relationships with vendors, ensuring loyalty that couldn't be bought or replaced overnight. To them, people were just line items. To me, they were leverage. And they'd just severed the only person who kept that leverage from turning into a noose. I remember every detail of that final meeting, the way Diane from HR couldn't quite meet my eye, the overcompensating smiles from the new CFO, Tyler, who had been with us for barely 6 months. He did most of the talking, which made sense. It was his optimization plan that led to this moment. "Miles," he said, "your compensation package is no longer aligned with our future structure." It sounded so polished, so rehearsed. He probably practiced that line in the mirror. I leaned back, crossed my arms, and nodded slowly. I didn't fight it. I didn't ask questions. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle them. Tyler expected pushback. Diane probably braced for an outburst. Instead, I simply asked, "When's my last day?" That's when I saw it, the flicker of doubt in Tyler's eyes. Somewhere deep down, he realized he didn't understand what he was dismantling. But it was too late. The paper was signed. The trap was set. They just didn't know it yet. I walked out of that building without ceremony. No farewell party, no thank you notes, not even a final handshake from the people I'd helped make rich. Just a cardboard box and a badge that no longer scanned at the door. I could feel the tension behind me, like they were afraid I might cause a scene. But I didn't give them the satisfaction. I walked out quiet, calm, and completely in control. Because I knew something they didn't. I wasn't done with them. Not by a long shot. As I stood at the sidewalk, watching my breath in the cold morning air, I opened my phone. 37 vendor contacts, most on speed dial. I'd negotiated every deal, built every bridge, and maintained every handshake agreement that kept Aldridge and Keene running smoothly. And not a single one of those agreements existed without my name attached. I wasn't just leaving, I was taking the foundation with me. They'd thrown me out without warning. They were about to learn what that cost. They thought I was just a senior procurement manager. That's what the org chart said. But in reality, I was the architect behind nearly every critical relationship this company had. I knew which vendors could bend during a crisis, which ones required a dinner and a favor, and which ones would walk at the first sign of disrespect. I had built those bridges over years of late nights, cross-country flights, quiet backroom negotiations, and trust, something spreadsheets couldn't measure. Most of those vendors didn't know anyone else at Aldridge and Keene. To them, the company was me. When I called, they picked up. When I asked for a favor, they moved mountains. But none of that mattered to the executives. They saw my salary and decided I was dead weight. It was a fatal mistake. Because in their haste to cut costs, they didn't just lose an employee, they lost their backbone. And they were about to find out how fast a company crumbles without one. What they didn't know could fill volumes. Tyler, the new CFO, saw my role as replaceable because he didn't understand the nuances of loyalty. He thought contracts were just documents, legal shields for business. But they were more than that. Those contracts were relationships, living things, nurtured over time. I knew every clause, every loophole, every handshake condition that went unsaid but always understood. These weren't just deals, they were alliances. And most of them wouldn't survive my exit. They thought they were being clever, bringing in some consultant to absorb my responsibilities. I laughed when I heard his name, Bradley, fresh out of an MBA program with zero real-world grit. A guy like that couldn't navigate a supplier dispute if his life depended on it. He wouldn't know how to de-escalate a pricing standoff or salvage a delayed shipment from Taiwan. And more importantly, he had no history with these people. They wouldn't trust him. Not without me. And soon, that trust, or lack of it, would cost them. Every business has a network. What they didn't grasp was that I was the spider at the center of the web. Over 12 years, I had built something intricate and resilient, connections that transcended contracts. These weren't just vendors or service providers. They were people I'd flown across oceans to meet, whose weddings I'd attended, whose kids' birthdays I remembered. You don't replace that with LinkedIn messages and a new email signature. They underestimated how personal business becomes when you've been through the fire together. When a factory in Malaysia burned down, I was the one who arranged a backup facility in under 48 hours. When raw material costs spiked globally, I brokered a 6-month freeze that saved us a fortune. That kind of loyalty doesn't come from a job title. It comes from showing up again and again, even when it's hard. They saw my web as overhead. But once I stepped away, that web started unraveling, strand by strand, right under their feet. Every contract they thought they owned had my fingerprints on it. And with those fingerprints came nuance, Details I never wrote down, but always remembered. Grace periods, favored client clauses, silent discounts contingent on my word. I knew exactly how long each vendor would wait for payment before pulling the plug. I knew who had backdoor terms and which ones included automatic escalation clauses if mishandled. That knowledge wasn't stored in any document, it was in me. So when Bradley began reaching out, trying to transition the accounts, I watched from afar as the doors closed on him. Politely, at first. Then more bluntly. "We'll wait for Miles," one supplier told him. Another simply said, "Without Carter, we're reviewing our partnership." They were starting to realize that without my voice on the line, those contracts weren't locked in stone, they were written on sand. And the tide had just begun to roll in. That's when the panic began to ripple through the executive floor. It started small. A vendor who usually delivered within 72 hours suddenly had logistical issues. Then another one flagged their payment terms for renegotiation, something they hadn't done in 6 years. By the end of the second week, 3 key partners had issued formal notices of review. The execs scrambled, of course. Meetings were called, consultants brought in, emails sent in desperation. But the truth was glaringly obvious. The vendors were no longer playing ball. Because I wasn't the one asking. Bradley couldn't fix it. Tyler couldn't understand it. Diane just watched as vendor relationships, once airtight, began slipping through their fingers. I heard from a friend in logistics that one of our biggest packaging partners had stopped answering calls altogether. They were circling the wagons, and the board was noticing. It was beautiful, really, watching them try to operate a machine while ignoring the guy who built the wiring. They wanted fresh blood. Well, now they were bleeding. And the cuts were only getting deeper. By the third week, the cracks turned to chasms. 3 top vendors officially terminated their contracts, citing instability in leadership and lack of continuity. That was code for, "We don't trust the new guy." Another paused all production for Aldridge in keen orders, demanding upfront payments instead of 30-day terms. And yet another vendor, one I personally convinced to give us exclusive pricing, handed that same offer to a direct competitor. That one stung them the most, and they knew exactly why it happened. The company was now burning resources just to stay afloat. Rush orders, emergency fees, temporary outsourcing, it added up fast. But what stung them even more was that none of it would have happened if I were still there. I wasn't sabotaging them. I didn't need to. I just wasn't buffering them anymore. Without me, the trust network collapsed. Their safety net had vanished. And from my quiet new office across town, I watched every dropped partnership as a message. You let go of the wrong guy. By the end of the month, the ripple effects hit our clients. Orders were late. Materials didn't show up. Deliverables missed their mark by days, sometimes weeks. Clients started calling. At first, they reached out to their usual contacts, only to be redirected, stalled, or outright ignored. Then the emails started coming in, escalating concerns about fulfillment consistency and operational disruption. I didn't need to be in the building to feel the tension. I could hear it in the silence from people who used to copy me on every critical update. Clients weren't just annoyed, they were livid. Some of them had been with us for years, because I made sure they got what they needed when they needed it. That loyalty didn't magically transfer to the company once I was gone. When their trust broke, they started walking. I got a message from an old client, blunt and bitter, "Should have kept you. They've got no idea what they're doing." That was when I knew it wasn't just the vendors. The customers were slipping, too. Board members don't usually meddle in day-to-day operations. But when delays turn into penalties and penalties turn into lawsuits, they start poking around. I heard from a friend, someone still on the inside, still loyal, that questions were flying in every direction. Why are key vendors pulling out? What happened to our procurement flow? Why weren't we informed earlier? They didn't have answers. Tyler tried to spin it as transition turbulence, but the board wasn't buying it. The audit they initiated was brutal. It revealed just how much of the company's infrastructure had been built on informal agreements and personal credibility. Mine. The numbers showed something even worse: rising costs, falling client retention, and a 6-month outlook that looked more like a cliff than a curve. The board started naming names, demanding accountability. The irony? I used to be the one who kept those board reports squeaky clean. Now, they were using them to dismantle the very people who thought I was expendable. I returned to the building once, just once, under the pretense of a forgotten file. The looks I got were priceless. Panic, regret, desperation. They didn't say anything, but their eyes were loud. The same people who barely looked up when I walked out were now frozen in place, pretending not to notice. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. One look through the glass conference rooms told me everything. People were sweating. Phones were ringing non-stop. The quiet hum of a well-oiled business had become chaos. I saw Tyler pacing, Diane frantically typing, Bradley hunched over a laptop, shoulders tense, a consultant whispering in his ear. They were unraveling, fast. They were trying to patch leaks in a boat with holes they didn't even know existed. And the worst part for them: none of it was illegal. None of it was malicious. I hadn't touched a single system. I hadn't breached a thing. I had simply stepped away and let the truth of their decisions flood the place. It came 3 days after the third major client dropped. A private number. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. Miles? It's Tyler. We need to talk. I let him speak. Let him stumble through corporate pleasantries and vague apologies. He talked about returning to our roots and rebuilding trust. I waited. Then, quietly, I asked, "What do you need, Tyler?" There was a long pause. He sighed. "We need you back. The board wants you to consult, short-term, of course." I smiled. Not because of the offer, but because they were finally tasting humility. They thought they could replace a decade of relationships with spreadsheets and arrogance. And now they were calling the very person they discarded. I told him I'd think about it. I told him I'd send terms. But what I didn't tell him was this: I'd already moved on. I had a better offer. One where I wasn't underappreciated. Still, I wasn't done. If I returned, it would be on my terms. When I finally walked back into the boardroom, I didn't come alone. I brought in my own firm, independent, respected, and entirely separate from Aldridge and Keene. My title was external consultant, but the truth was everyone in that room knew I was calling the shots. I wasn't there to save the company. I was there to save what was left of its contracts, at a price they'd never forget. My first condition? Tyler steps down. Second, Bradley's out. Third, I control all vendor communications. They agreed to everything. Desperation does that. They were drowning, and I was the only one who knew where the lifeboats were. I didn't gloat. I didn't take revenge with words. I let the contract speak for me. 6 figures, 3 months, no oversight. I came in, fixed what they couldn't, stabilized what they shattered. But I didn't stay. I wasn't their employee anymore. I was the ghost they begged back, the one who never raised his voice, but somehow owned the room. There's a different kind of power in silence. Not passive silence, but strategic silence. The kind that unnerves people more than shouting ever could. I didn't make demands in that boardroom. I presented facts. Vendor losses, client churn, financial damage. And I calmly explained how I could reverse it all. Not because I needed them, but because they needed me. Every executive who had once dismissed me now leaned forward, hanging on every word I said. Funny how quickly things change when control shifts. And I had all the control. Quietly. Without a title. Without stepping on toes. Just by being the one person in the room who understood the language of relationships, not spreadsheets. That scared them more than anything else, that they hadn't even realized how dependent they were on someone they labeled too expensive. I became their last resort, their lifeline, their redemption story. And I made sure they understood. I wasn't the past they discarded, I was the only future they had left. They'd always believed leadership was about vision boards and high-level meetings. They were wrong. Leadership is knowing who moves the levers behind the scenes, and being the one who knows how to move them better than anyone. I didn't need the CEO's chair or a fancy corner office. I had something far more valuable, the trust of every person who actually kept the business alive. Vendors, clients, logistics heads, legal teams, the people who mattered. And now, every decision passed through me. Even temporarily, I became the unspoken authority in that building. They nodded through my recommendations, approved my action plans without question. I wasn't there to punish, I was there to prove a point. When you run a company on arrogance and short-term numbers, you miss the long game. I had run this ship for years. Not with memos, but with influence. And now they finally saw it. By the time the final quarter ended, they weren't just dependent on me, they were terrified of losing me again. The same hands that pushed me out were now offering contracts, incentives, and promises they never would have considered months ago. Tyler, who once avoided eye contact, now opened meetings by asking my opinion. The board sent thank you emails. Diane apologized in a voicemail that sounded more personal than professional. They thought they could replace me, and now they were begging me to stay. It wasn't about ego for me. It was about validation. About truth. They finally saw the damage their short-sightedness had caused. But I didn't stay. I handed over my final report, closed my laptop, and stood up. They asked what it would take to keep me. I told them, nothing. You've already paid the price. And I walked out, not bitter, not smug, just satisfied. They had seen what happens when you confuse cost with value. They'd learned it the hard way. And they knew, deep down, that if they had just listened, none of this would have happened. That's all I ever wanted. Revenge doesn't always come in fury. Sometimes, it comes in the form of an invoice with your name at the top and a consulting fee they never imagined paying. It comes when you reclaim your worth in the exact language they tried to use against you. Numbers. I didn't burn bridges, I made them toll roads. If they wanted access to the systems I built, the contacts I nurtured, the wisdom they once dismissed, they had to pay. And they did. Heavily. It wasn't about money, though. It was about principle. About showing them that I was never too expensive, I was too essential. And that's something no company wants to admit. When I left the second time, I didn't take a box of belongings. I didn't need to. I had already taken everything that mattered the first time. My integrity, my experience, my leverage. My revenge wasn't loud. It was quiet. Professional. I walked away having proved what they never saw coming, that I was the asset they couldn't afford to lose. So if you were in my shoes, fired by a short-sighted CFO, discarded after years of loyalty, what would you have done? Would you have walked away quietly, or waited and played the long game like I did? Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't retaliation, it's watching the empire tremble because they removed the wrong pillar. I didn't sabotage them. I didn't need to. I simply let them feel the consequences of undervaluing the wrong person. And let me ask you, have you ever seen someone get fired by someone half as experienced, only to have the company come crawling back months later? If so, you know exactly what I mean. Never underestimate your worth just because someone else fails to see it. And never forget, influence outlasts titles. Thanks for listening to my story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss a new revenge story. Because there's always more than meets the eye. If you were in my shoes, would you have stayed quiet? Or played the long game like I did? And have you ever seen someone get fired by someone way less experienced? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss a new revenge story. There's always more than meets the eye.